Siamo abbastanza in
We are
imbarazzo.
very much embarrassed because of the delay, but first we would like to thank the organizers to let us illustrate our research work. We're quite embarrassed because we're not historians, we're not philosophers, we're not semiologists, we are two architects. So we are a category, well, it's not shameful to be architects, but, well, we have an architecture historian, but still. Okay, let's move on. We will try to stick to 20 minutes, and please forgive us if we're going to say things that have already been said. So collective memory was very important when it comes to the fight for the power. And the speaker is reading a text very fast, so the interpreter apologizes. So we would like to start our presentation by starting from a quotation by Jacques Le Goff that was read too fast. We do apologize, but this is to understand the destiny of this place. And on this slide, we have recapped things that you all know. But in 1936, criteria are set to build concentration camps. So specific guidelines are set about the construction of such places. And which are the ideal venues? Well, they can vary a lot, from island to isolated places. So these camps can be built on purpose to host inconvenient people, like the Pasticci one, where political DPs are sort of sent for labor, and Ferramonti. But also, there are pre-existing buildings that are reused, like barracks, villas. This is Villa La Silvia at Bagno a Ripoli, or the Fossoli camp that you are going to visit tomorrow, or detention camps that are located inside pre-existing facilities. So basically, we want to underscore one thing. These places and these buildings are always built as temporary facilities, so with poor materials and poor structures. So for us as architects, it is interesting and important to understand the sort of construction principles. Good afternoon, well, good evening. What is left of all that? Well, things that have been then very much changed over the years. We have places that will then be turned into memorials. This is a confinement house for Carlo Levi. And then we have venues and buildings that will be dismantled, emptied, destroyed. Of some of them we have just a plate or a memorial stone that is left. Then we have places like Fossoli that are very peculiar, because even though they are downsized and lose some parts, what remains, considering also the layering of history on the very same place, gives new blood to these places. So there is a sort of natural and spontaneous regeneration of the place that opens up new interpretations to better understand the whole past history, and that more easily leads to enhancement. And then we have places where little remains. This is the case of Bolzano. And we have, for instance, the surrounding wall, and the internal part has been dismantled. And then we have another case, was of the Riziera di San Sabba. That is another interesting case that has to do with, again, the reuse and enhancement of the strongest parts, but again with refurbishment, renovations, changes, adaptations to a memorial place, to a museum. And again, this is a place for memory set up in a memorial site. This morning, Professor Schwartz appreciated the word acknowledging, but if we have a look at what Cesare Brandi writes about the definition of restoration, well, we know that it is a methodological way to acknowledge something. So, there are several things to be considered. There is a research project that we have used as a sort of starting point. This website by Herzeg and Giuseppini, where several camps are identified, different venues, different facilities. If you click on these dots, you will visualize further information about also the function, who was hosted there, the localization, there are documents, there is bibliography, but we do not really know what is left of all that. I also deal with castles, and I didn't know that this castle hosted for a period of time some English people and some Jews that were there in transit. So for us, the very first thing is to understand the texture of things, what is left of that past. So we have a rather interesting legislation specifically related to the protection and preservation. Maybe there are some people who are already knowledgeable about these topics, but maybe not everybody. So I think that is interesting to get to know the legislation of cultural hazards. So in some cases, it is not that easy to sort of identify the value of a place. There is lacking information, and very often materials being used were extremely poor, as we said, because these places were considered as temporary places. This is the definition of cultural interest. I talked about obsolescence, and there can be a special order for assets of at least 70 years of age. Until some years ago, 50 were enough. And well, because when it comes to our own objects of work, everything relating to memory risks to be sort of left or lost, and so we need to decide what to do. Let them go or preserve them. Then there can also be special provisions and measures. So we have the 70 years rule, but if it's worth, even younger assets can be preserved. So again,
dalla loro età.
There are things that are meaningful because they are related to specific traumatic event or to specific historic moment.
In mente che il sedime delle
For
torri
instance,
gemelle dopo l'11 settembre, perché passato poco tempo ci
the
ricostruiamo allegramente
Twin Tower area,
e poi c'è un altro,
even if it's quite young, has a special value. And then there are special laws, and we have one in 2001. There is a piece of legislation that decides to preserve the heritage of the First World War. So why is this rule implemented in the Cultural Law of 2004? Well, because this law considers these assets as part of specific heritage. So it's not just a matter of preservation. There is something different at stake, because usually the administration, the public administration, has to preserve and enhance some cultural heritage. So then there is the need to identify possible cultural traits. Well, of course, it would be advisable to have a similar piece of legislation for the Second World War. But actually, we haven't reached that point yet. Still, the state has protected partially parts of these places that are places of shame. And we have the San Saba rice paddy, and there is a civil servant of the Heritage and Cultural Assets Superintendent will be part of the jury judging the contest for ideas that had been launched. So first of all, we need to understand that the rules as such won't cover the whole camp area, but only a part. And so this is a limitation with respect to the physical extension. But most of all, what is interesting is the way to get close to this area and to this reality. The rice paddy becomes the very same object on which the designers that have been invited to set up a monument to pay homage to the resistance movement start to work by reducing more and more the amount of matter to be used. So we know which is the project that is going to be when, and the project is going to be built. I think that this project is absolutely charming and fascinating, but let's talk about the beautiful cross room. But personally, I'm afraid of the dark. I've always been afraid of the dark and of the noise at night. Think about what it would mean to stay in a cell with people walking all around and maybe hear those sounds in the middle of the night. So all that has disappeared somehow. So I think that this is a masterpiece, but this is a masterpiece that needs to be put in a context. So I think that the fact of experiencing things is something that is a negative side. And this is Ferramonte of di Tarsia. You see, it is almost a naked place. And We have the former
Anche qui
police camp
potremmo
in
descriverlo, ma
Bolzano.
taglieremo. È
And
interessante
this is
questa
a
immagine.
very interesting
Guardate cosa
picture.
resta del campo. Resta
Look
una
at
linea
what
rossa, una
is
sottile linea
left.
rossa, cioè resta un muro
Very
che
fine
contiene delle
and
vincolanti.
thin red
Siamo
line.
nel 2003.
It's 2003,
L'ultimo decreto
Decree
2011,
2011,
quello del
by
Ministero
the
sempre dei
Ministry
beni
of
culturali,
Cultural
che tutela
Assets
l'ex campo di
to
Fossoli. Per
protect
fortuna non
the
solo il
Fossoli
campo
camp,
vecchio,
not
ma
only
anche
the new
non solo il
camp but
campo
also
nuovo,
the
ma
old
anche il
camp.
campo vecchio, dove sarebbe anche
It would be
interessante
interesting, for
attivare,
instance, and we
ne
have
abbiamo
already
parlato
talked
in
about that
fondazione,
within the
una serie
foundation,
di indagini
to
di archeologia di superficie,
launch
di
a
olocausto, per
specific
verificare
investigation work
eventuali
to
tracce di
identify
si è perduto. Ma anche qui,
traces
per fortuna, il
of the
Ministero ha
past,
tutelato
but
il
again, the
luogo.
naked place has been identified
Però
as
se
the
si legge
object to
bene
be
il campo,
preserved.
se si legge bene il decreto di
But
vincolo,
again,
si
if you
tutela
read
una
carefully,
fase del campo,
you see
mentre
that
invece abbiamo
only,
sentito, cioè
let's say, a
se
part
legge
of the
bene il
camp
libro,
is going to
si
be
tutela le
preserved.
scatole, ma non
So,
si tutela quello che c'è dentro, ma quello che c'è dentro,
not
noi
specifically
abbiamo
the
appena sentito,
contained
è
part,
uno
but the
strato,
container
quello di
part.
Philadelphia.
We
Un
have
altro
several
strato che ci fa
layers
onore,
here,
quello dell'accoglienza
Philadelphia,
dei
but
profughi
also
giuliano-dalmati.
the
E quindi,
Julian-Dalmatian
tutto sommato,
refugees.
l'attività di
So
tutela
the
diventa complessa,
stratification
perché
of the
significa tutelare
activities
una stratificazione
is
che
not to be preserved pursuant by the law.
esiste quindi
And then
un'altra
there is a
forma
different
diversa di
form
tutela.
of protection.
Allora, la definizione di tutela
When it comes to preservation and protection, this refers to some things that we consider as very important.
Naturalmente io non la leggo perché è scritta lì, però vi sottolineo che la base è un'adeguata attività conoscitiva.
It is important to carry out any protection activity to know very well the thing to be protected. So it is
che già di fatto esiste.
such a prospection activity needs to be done at several levels.
Ora, sappiamo bene, l'abbiamo sentito anche questo.
We heard this several times, and there is a huge quantity of documents on these topics, on these issues, and on these camps. But unfortunately, these documentation are rather scattered, and sometimes is very sort of local and specific. So, in order to carry out projects in this field, you have to set up networks. And then, another major goal is to guarantee the preservation of what is left. But
tutto ciò, come ho detto prima, viene ratificato
all this
quando c'è una spinta culturale verso questa cosa e non è
is possible only if there is a sort of cultural drive going beyond the state administration. From 2005, there is a convention on the cultural heritage for society. This is the FARA convention, aiming at acknowledging the right to cultural heritage that is part of the right to cultural life. And so, it's not just the state that should take up this responsibility, but even individual citizens should go beyond the idea that monuments do not belong to anybody. No, it's not like that. Monuments belong to everybody because each individual, each citizen is responsible for them. And this offers a new interpretation because voluntary worker associations are acknowledged as very important. So I will say words of praise of the work of a foundation like the Fossoli Foundation, because I mean, voluntary workers associations do not replace the state, but just simply concur to the fact that the state can better carry out its protection function, so that the citizen can be better aware of their sort of heritage, so that people, like in the case of Fossoli, should be aware also of the value of such a place.
uno dei temi che emerge con forza da queste giornate di lavori è quello della
The
responsabilità.
key word is accountability. We are all accountable for these assets, and we have to be held accountable when we see things that we consider unfair. So monuments belong to us, we're responsible for them. So it is our duty to preserve them and not to let them be abandoned. There are stones that, let's say, convey messages, but there are fragile and frail memories that needs to be preserved. In this respect, public-private partnerships are key, but also collaborations with foundations and local authorities. And we have here an excellent case, that of the Fossoli Foundation, that started establishing a partnership with the University of Bologna, and the Fossoli Foundation started a reorganization work of the archival documents, and then investigation was carried out to see what could be done with the facilities on the spot. And so much has been done in terms of research work and measurements. Please notice on this slide that really, when you enter those barracks, you are in a sort of contemporary piece of remains. The external walls
della creazione del campo, no, per la deportazione.
So you really have the perception of the original place, and then you have other facilities built by the Monnovadelphia community. And then you have a giuliano-dalmati designs against humidity protections, and then the false ceilings and the stencils and so on and so forth. It's all a sort of an interplay of stratifications, and then you have an earthquake, and you have pieces of putties that just fall down, and you discover hidden inscriptions, and then, I mean, it's all a sort of patchwork of stratifications and layers and pieces, like a puzzle. I think that this is the beauty of Fossoli, being so stratified that you can discover a lot about a very shameful page of the history of our country, but also some good examples of welcoming policies vis-à-vis refugees. Okay. Thank you for giving us the time.